For 20 years, the land slept beneath the ashes until one man came back and woke it again. A story of water, memory, and the heartbeat of the earth. Subscribe to feel the valley's pulse, leave a like, and keep the story alive. The road into the valley had forgotten what color looked like. It wound through a country of soot and wiregrass, through fences turned to ribs and trees standing like charred antlers against a washed-out sky. Samuel Martin guided his truck along it as if following the memory of a map only his bones remembered. The engine complained with a thin metallic rattle. The windshield bore a starburst crack right where the world narrowed into the future. He drove with both hands firm on the wheel, not because the road demanded it, but because grief had never taught him how to let go. 20 years had slipped by since the fire, and yet ash still found a way into everything, into paint, into teeth, into the pauses between words. People in town had said the old place was gone beyond saving, gone the way of barns that wander into lightning. They told him to sell the land, to sign it over and call it mercy. He agreed, out loud, because that was easier than saying he was afraid to face the ghosts. But when Anna was buried and the house in town went quiet, a sound older than sorrow began to stir. It was not a voice in his head, not exactly. More like the steadiness of a drum too far away to hear, only feel. It tapped out the way back here. He crested the final bend, and the valley spread itself beneath him like a scar the world preferred not to look at. Where the farmhouse had stood was a scatter of collapsed stones and blackened beams. The barn was a rib cage. The windmill, once a lean hand against the sky, lay twisted beside the mouth of a well he had known as a boy. Even from the road he could tell the ground wore the hard glaze of long-baked ash, brittle under the sun. The mountains beyond, patient and blue, seemed to keep their distance. He shut off the truck at the old gate, and silence folded over the engine's last ticking breath. When he stepped down, the ash gave, soft as sifted flour, and took his weight with a sigh. He stood and let the place introduce itself again. There was the orchard line, now a procession of stumps like the teeth of a rusted comb. There was the lane where wagons used to murmur, where his father's voice could still be coaxed out of the air if the hour was late enough. There was the wind, shouldering through miles of ruin, gentle as a hand and cold as a lie. He moved slowly, the way a man approaches a grave he helped dig. He found the old porch by the geometry of what was missing, then the steps by the way his boots remembered their rise. He bent and lifted a horseshoe from the ash. It had come through the fire, as iron does, blacked, a little warped, still itself. He turned it in his palm the way some men turn prayers. When he could no longer avoid it, he crossed the yard to the well. As a boy, he had thrown pebbles into this throat of stone just to hear the pause before the plunk. As a man, he had drawn water every morning until his shoulder learned the rhythm of that weight. The cover now was a broken jaw of boards, sunk inward. The iron crank was stiff with rust. He leaned over. The darkness returned his look without interest. He told himself he was only here to see it one last time, to gather what could be sold, to take a final measure of loss. But his hands were already at the debris, pulling, levering, clearing. The labor caught in his back, then settled into the old harness of work he had sworn he'd never wear again. Sun slid toward the ridge. Shadows braided themselves across the ruin. When he finally stopped, sweat had mapped his shirt and grit pasted his wrists gray to the elbow. The well's mouth lay open, black and round as a pupil. He listened and heard nothing. That was almost a comfort. A clean kind of emptiness is easier than being reminded of what you lost. but stubbornness is a habit that outlives men. He fetched the shovel from the truck and began to scoop ash from the inner ring, working the blade between the stones, prying loose what the collapse had swallowed. It was clumsy work in a tight circle. The shovel's steel rasped, stones clicked, ash whispered down the shaft like a secret repeating itself. Near dusk, the shovel struck something that sounded unlike stone. He paused. The stillness folded closer. He knocked again, softer, a hollow. He crouched, reached in, and cleared a wedge of timber that had jammed partway down. As he tugged it free, a small pebble tumbled from the lip and vanished. A heartbeat later came a sound so faint he thought he'd imagined it. The tiniest sip, the gentlest vowel of a splash. He let the breath in his chest go slow. He set another pebble on the rim and nudged it into the dark. The pause was longer this time. The splash was not. Water, down there where the world had been convinced nothing remained. He stood very still, the shovel slack in his hand. He felt foolish, and then felt a different thing, something that began just under his ribs and rose until the skin at his collar prickled. He tied the old rope from the truck to the bucket that had lived behind the seat longer than he had lived with good sense. The crank fought him, but turned. Rope unspooled and the bucket sank with a faint jiggle of weight when it met the surface below. He lowered until the rope eased, then drew it up hand over hand, the fibers biting his palms like the old days. The bucket came into air beaded with droplets that were silver even in this thin light. He set it on the broken circle and stared at plain water as if it were a miracle. He cupped his hand and tasted. Cold, stone, a sweetness like the last note of a hymn. He closed his eyes and let it run through a man hollowed by years and grief. He slept in the truck that night because beds take faith, and he hadn't earned that yet. The stars came out with their stubborn choreography. Once, a coyote stitched the far edge of the field and left it as he found it. When dawn walked down the slope, the valley looked almost kinder. He climbed out with the shovel, sore in the honest ways, and returned to the circle of stone as if it had kept a seat for him. Work is a language the land speaks back in. He cleared the last of the collapsed cover and pried away stones that had shifted. He brushed the inner wall with a broom of dry stalks until the joints of the ring showed neat as stitching. He drew and drew again until the water ran clean of the ash his work had troubled. By midday, the ground close to the rim wore a darker shade, as if some subterranean pulse had reached up and pressed its palm there. He did not plan to stay. He did not permit himself hope in words. He did what a man does when the world has reduced itself to two choices. He made a shelter. He salvaged beams that the fire had spared through pure caprice and leaned them into a rude frame against the lee of the barn's surviving wall. He found a length of tarp, hauled it into position, and tied it down. When wind fingered the edges, the whole thing thrummed like a low string. He sat in the shade it made, the bucket beside him, and watched the circle of damp widen. Toward evening, the clouds arrived too thin to be trusted, and then trusted anyway. Rain began as if embarrassed to be heard, then gathered into a patient insistence that belonged to older orders than fire. He stood in it with his face lifted, the way he had lifted his face to receive bad news and blessings, because both demand the same stillness. The tarp took the drumming. The ground loosened. The air learned a new smell, clean dust. When night folded itself over the fields, the well's water spoke in a voice you could almost call a murmur. He woke to fog pooled low, the sky pearl-colored. The darker ring around the well had become a scalloped band, and in it a flare of green had dared itself through. He squatted on sore knees and touched two blades of grass with a careful finger. They trembled like foals. He laughed once, the sound quick and private. He would not sell. The thought came without his consent, and then sat there, plain as a post in a field. The day arranged itself around useful fictions. If he straightened the stones, he would leave. If he improved the crank, he would leave. If he traced where the damp ran, he would leave. Each task braided into the next. He cleared a circle wider, then wider still, until his arms ached in a way that teased old pride. He set a new cover from boards scavenged from the barn, planed smooth by sand and patience, and burned his initials into the edge with a nail and a match head, because that is how men mark time without calendars. He thought, more than once, about how the water moved under him. The land had a slope his father had taught him to know by the angle of a poured cup. He cut a narrow furrow from the well's lip toward what used to be the north field. He carried the bucket, spilled it along the trench, and watched the water find its groove. It went forward with a mind like a mule's, slow until asked, then steady. He smiled, and the smile felt like a door he hadn't opened in years. Around noon, a shape paused on the road, a truck he did not recognize. He expected men and talk and the burden of explaining miracles to those who have already decided miracles aren't respectable. But the truck idled and then went on. He was grateful in a way that did not require him to examine why. By late afternoon, he could hear insects. At first, he mistook the sound for a trick of wind under tin. Then the truth arranged itself in his ear. The valley, having mislaid its voice for 2 decades, was clearing its throat. A frog, when the light went soft, made a single dry noise from the trench he had cut. The sound went into him like a key finding an old lock. He made tea in a dented tin and let it cool while he listened. He did not make plans. Plans are loud. The land dislikes shouting. He took inventory instead. Boards enough for a smaller fence to mark a perimeter around the well, nails, rope, a tarp that would not last the first honest storm, a shovel that had not failed him yet. He counted what could be done with 2 hands and daylight. When the second night came, it came with a quiet he no longer mistook for emptiness. The well's surface held a trembling coin of moon. The damp widened touch by touch. He slept with his boots beside him and his hand near the rope as if the water might require guarding. Morning found him earlier, as if the valley had wound the clock inside him back a notch. He drew and drank. He knelt and pressed his palm into the soil. The cool came up to meet him. He thought of his father's saying, "The earth sleeps when we stop listening," and felt foolish for having called the land dead just because he had run out of words for it. Through that day, through the next, the work repeated itself with the kind of variation only labor recognizes as music. He scraped, lifted, set, and tamped. In the shade of the makeshift shelter, he laid out the objects he'd found among the ruins: the bent horseshoe, a hinge, a half-charred ledger board with a single nail still bright in its hole. He let the sun do what it could to what he could not mend. On the 4th morning, after coffee boiled thin and black, he walked the yard with the deliberate gait of inspection and found the ground by the barn a shade darker than it had any right to be. Not rain. There'd been none that night. He crouched, damp. He pressed and felt a give from below like breath through pursed lips. It was nothing more than the earth telling him a story he had not learned yet. He stood and looked at the line the dark made, and it pointed, at least to his eye, a little west of the well. He did not go digging there. Not yet. He understood, in the slow way sense arrives to men who have been wrong before, that discovery has its own tempo. He focused on what stood before him like an altar: the stone circle, the crank that now turned without wince, the trench that carried a ribbon of motion through ground that had forgotten verbs. He widened the trench and watched water brighten its path like a stitched seam catching light. Toward evening, a thin breeze shouldered in from the south, and with it the scent of rain so distant it existed more in promise than fact. He sat on the beam that used to be a barn's thought of itself and watched dust lift off the fields in long sighs. He felt tired in a way he trusted. He felt present in a way he recognized from seasons before. Sorrow taught him its arithmetic. He did not think of the men in town or their opinions. He did not think of money or contracts or signatures that move land from one name to another. He thought of tools. He thought of how water chooses, always, the low road, and how a life is made by recognizing where the ground falls away beneath you and letting good things run that direction. When dark slipped down the slope again, he fed a small fire with scraps of board, too twisted for any nobler purpose. The flames licked and talked in their dry language. He held out his hands, felt the heat reach in and unmake the ache along his knuckles. He listened. To wind, to insects, to the small, disciplined voice of the well. At some point, he caught himself humming a tune that had lived in the kitchen once, Anna's tune, made of flour dust and the soft thunder of bread on a board. He did not stop. He let it make a loop around the firelight and back into him. Above, the stars did exactly what they were supposed to do. They held. Before he slept, he walked to the trench and followed it by lantern, the flame clipping shadows out of weeds that had no right to be here and were here anyway. In the lantern's little globe of world, the water looked like a ribbon worked through a needle's eye. It made a steady sound against the shallow banks he had pressed smooth with his boot. He knelt and dipped his fingers. Cold climbed his hand like a ladder rung by rung. He thought, not as a vow, but as a simple sentence he could carry, "I will stay until I know what this means." At dawn, mist again, fine as breath, silver where it caught. The circle of grass had grown into a crescent. The crescent would become a ring. The ring would become a field. He could see it, not as a miracle, but as the inevitable proof that the earth forgives our doubt if we return to work. He boiled coffee, swallowed the bitterness, and found it good. He set his shoulders to the day. The well waited, patient as a held note. The land, which had endured the arrogance of fire and the long neglect of men, seemed prepared to attempt a sentence. He would listen. He would answer with his hands. By mid-morning, a cloud bank shouldered over the ridge and began to fall apart in the useful way clouds sometimes do, parceling out their mercy. The first drops stitched into the tarp and stitched into the dirt. The smell that rose tasted of iron and clean beginnings. Samuel stood with the rope in his palm and watched the water inside the well take the sky's offering and remain itself, clear and cold and simple. He did not see the future as a line. He saw it as a circle widening from this stone mouth outward through ash into grass, into work, into sleep, into morning again. The valley, quiet for too long, cleared its throat a second time. Somewhere near the far fence a bird tried out a note and found the rest of the song. Samuel Martin turned the crank, listened to the old wood creak in the right places, and felt the bucket lift, heavy with what the world keeps hidden until you ask with both hands. He drew it up, and the water rose to meet him. The morning broke pale and thin, light washing over the valley as if hesitant to touch what had once burned. Samuel Martin rose before the sun had fully breached the ridge. His body complained. Every muscle ached with the honest kind of pain that comes from doing something that matters. The fire's ghosts were still there, sleeping under the ash, but they were quieter now. The sound of water, living, whispering water, had taken their place. He began the day the way he had ended the last, at the well. Steam curled from his coffee tin as he leaned against the stone rim and stared down into the darkness that now shimmered faintly with reflected light. It felt wrong to call it darkness anymore. Something down there moved, patient, deliberate. The water breathed. When he lowered the bucket, the rope hummed under its weight. He drew the water up and poured it into a small trench leading toward the field. The ground accepted it greedily, darkening where it touched. The scent that rose, damp earth, minerals, the faint sweetness of rebirth, filled his lungs like medicine. By mid-morning, the mist had burned away. The horizon opened into a clean blue stretch of sky. Samuel worked along the edge of the yard, clearing debris and pulling up the charred remnants of fence posts. The work was slow but sure. The land no longer resisted him. He found that if he struck his shovel just so, the soil gave with a kind of quiet sigh, as though it remembered being turned by hands that cared. At noon, he rested beneath the frame of his half-built shelter and ate bread from his tin. The wind moved differently now, softer, more circular, carrying the whisper of grass blades bending somewhere beyond his sight. He realized then that silence could change tone. Once, this valley's stillness had been heavy and final. Now it was waiting. When the sun dipped lower, he decided to explore. He walked beyond the main clearing where the ruins of the barn slumped like old bones. As he moved, the ground subtly changed. The farther he went, the cooler it felt underfoot. The soil near the barn had darkened overnight, the moisture seeping farther than logic allowed. Samuel crouched, pressing his fingers into it. It was damp again, not from rain. The well's water was spreading. He followed the gradient with a farmer's instinct, tracing where the soil darkened into faint channels invisible at first glance. He brushed away the ash with his boot and saw a shallow groove beneath, a man-made line carved in the distant past. It ran straight from the well toward the barn, then veered west. He felt a ripple of recognition, the kind that rises from some old story you once overheard but never truly understood. He'd heard his father speak of underground veins, the water bones of the land, he'd called them. Channels laid by ancestors who understood that a farm without movement was already dying. Samuel had never believed the tales. Yet here was proof, sleeping beneath the ash all along. As the day faded, he unearthed more of the pattern, a lattice of grooves, each leading outward like spokes from the heart of a wheel. He cleaned them with his hands until his nails turned black and the sun dropped low enough to stain the valley gold. When he stood back, breathing hard, the lines glowed faintly under the thin light, filled now with the slow crawl of water. That night, Samuel built a small fire near the well. The flames caught in the damp air, shimmering rather than roaring. The sound of frogs reached him from the far ditch, real, living frogs, their croaks sharp and sudden against the hush. He smiled without meaning to. He boiled a pot of tea, watching the steam drift into the air like a ghost leaving quietly. Across the darkened field, the lines he'd cleared glimmered where water reflected the moon. They looked like veins beneath skin, the land's pulse returning. He remembered his father's voice again, gravelly with the weight of work. The earth's a body, boy. You keep its veins open, you keep it alive. Back then, Samuel had laughed. Now, the truth stood before him, bright as silver. Sleep found him early. The fire burned low, the wind steady, but deep in the night, a sound woke him. Faint but deliberate, a dull knock beneath the earth, followed by a quiet tremor that rippled under his bedroll. He sat up, heart thudding. The ground stilled, then went silent. He told himself it was just set in stone. By morning, he wasn't so sure. When he walked to the well, the first thing he noticed was the water's movement. It no longer sat placid. Small ripples curled outward from the center, like something below was breathing faster. The surface seemed higher, too, an inch, maybe two. He lowered the bucket and watched it rise, heavy with more weight than before. When he pulled it up, the water shimmered differently, clearer, alive with motion. He filled his hands and drank, and a strange awareness crept through him, a memory that wasn't his. He could almost feel the years folding backward, the creak of wagon wheels, the rhythm of hooves, laughter from unseen mouths, the valley before flame. It came and went like a dream snatched by daylight, but it left him trembling. He spent the rest of the day working with renewed urgency. He cleared a larger section near the barn and found a flat slab of stone beneath the dirt. Not random, but shaped, smooth at the edges. As he brushed it clean, faint engravings appeared, a line, like a wave intersected by an arrow, the same emblem that had been carved on the old well handle when he was a child. He traced it with his fingertip. The stone was colder than the soil around it. Beneath, the hollow sound again, a muted echo that suggested more space below. He hesitated, then fetched his crowbar from the truck and wedged it under the stone. With a slow groan, it shifted. Air exhaled upward, cool, damp, carrying the scent of moss and forgotten time. He peered into the opening. A narrow passage slanted down, stone-lined and slick with moisture. Water glimmered faintly somewhere below. For a moment he thought of calling it folly and walking away. But something in the air, the same current that had drawn him back here in the first place, pushed him forward. He fetched his lantern, struck a match, and lowered himself into the dark. The stone beneath his boots was wet but solid. The passage was narrow enough that his shoulders brushed both walls. The air was thick, humming faintly with the echo of moving water. He followed the slope until it widened into a small chamber. There, on the walls, were carvings, crude maps of the valley, traced in lines that followed the shape of rivers, hills, and channels. In the dim light, he saw that they matched the grooves he had uncovered above. His great-grandfather's hand, maybe older still. The network wasn't accident. It was design, a living system built to breathe with the land. In the corner of the chamber sat a rusted tin box. Inside, he found folded papers, their ink faded but still legible. The handwriting struck him at once, strong, deliberate strokes he'd seen only once before, in the family Bible. He sat there in the damp silence and read. The notes described the construction of the underground irrigation, a network meant to feed the valley through drought, channeling the spring beneath the mountain into every field. Each vein began at the well, the heart, and spread outward like branches of a living thing. But the final pages changed tone. The words hurried, the pen pressed hard. There were mentions of neighbors, of demands, of threats. Then one final line that chilled him. If they come again, this place will not survive the fire. But if the well endures, the water will find its way home. He sat motionless for a long while, the damp pressing against his skin. He thought of the fire, the one that had devoured the farm 2 decades ago, and of how the official report had called it lightning. He had believed it because he'd needed to. But now the truth whispered beneath his feet. When he climbed back into daylight, the sun was already sinking. The air was cool, the first hints of autumn slipping through the valley. He looked at the well, its stones glistening faintly, and felt a surge of awe, fear, and purpose all tangled together. That night, as he sat by the fire, the flames reflected in the bucket of water beside him. The ripples caught the light, bending it into restless patterns across his face. He thought of his great-grandfather, of the courage it must have taken to bury something so precious, to hide life itself in the dark. Now that secret was awake again, and Samuel understood that the valley's return to life was no miracle. It was memory, the land remembering itself, calling through the years to anyone still listening. He looked toward the horizon, where the first faint lightning flickered far beyond the ridge. A storm was coming, but this time he would not run. The third dawn came with a copper light that slid between clouds and turned the valley into a shallow sea of mist. Samuel Martin woke stiff and slow, his muscles marked by the honest labor of rebuilding. The fire from the night before had collapsed into a low red bowl of coals. He poured water from the bucket, listening to the hiss, and the smell of wet ash rose like memory. He ate standing up, coffee so strong it scoured thought, a heel of bread gone hard at the edges. The morning air bit his skin and smelled faintly of iron and rain. He turned toward the well, the steady point that now pulled everything around it into orbit. The circle of damp soil had widened overnight. In the gray light, it looked like a slow heartbeat pressed into the earth. Samuel knelt and dipped his hand in. The water was colder than before, clearer, restless with small currents that hadn't been there the day prior. He had a sudden image, impossible, absurd, of veins pulsing beneath him, a living system whispering under the ash. He rose, brushed dirt from his palms, and began to work. He cleared more of the debris near the barn, stacking the charred boards into neat funeral piles. Every swing of the shovel sent a dull echo through the ground, and once, when he paused to catch breath, he could swear he heard another sound answering back, a soft, hollow knock far beneath. He told himself it was only stone settling. The valley was old. It had its own language of sighs. By midday the clouds thickened, the light gone pewter and strange. He took shelter beneath the tarp and studied the well's rim. The stones were ancient, irregular, their mortar crumbling in places. Between two blocks something caught the light, a thin seam of metal. He pried at it with the tip of his knife, flaking away bits of old clay until the outline of a plate appeared. It was small, about the size of his palm, half swallowed by the rock. Letters revealed themselves slowly, scratched deep and crude. Martin, 1872. His great-grandfather's hand, maybe his great-great. Beneath the name was a symbol, 3 lines radiating from a central point like water breaking from a spring. He sat back on his heels. The stories came rushing up, the ones his father had mumbled after whiskey about the heart below the farm, about how the land had once bled water like blood. Samuel had dismissed them, as children dismiss the mysticism of tired men. Now, staring at that old mark, he wasn't so sure. When the rain began, it came soft and slantwise, a drizzle that painted the ash into darker shades. Samuel kept working, prying loose the rest of the plate. Behind it was not solid stone, but a narrow gap. He pushed his knife in, felt air move against the blade. Hollow. He fetched his crowbar, wedged it into the crack, and leaned his weight. The stone shifted with a groan that seemed too deep for its size. When it came free, the gap widened into a black mouth, a small cavity descending beyond his reach. The air that escaped was cool and damp, and it carried a smell both raw and familiar, old soil, metal, and something like moss. Samuel fetched his lantern and lowered it in. Light trembled down stone steps slick with moisture. He hesitated. There were a dozen reasons not to go down: unstable ground, unseen gas, the simple madness of chasing ghosts, but curiosity had already taken him by the collar. He tied a rope around a beam, looped it through his belt, and descended. The steps led into a chamber no larger than a hay shed. The ceiling arched low. The walls were lined with flat stones fitted by hands that had known patience. Water glistened along the joints, trickling in fine threads into a shallow basin carved from the floor's center. He knelt beside it, touched the surface, and felt the tremor of a steady underground pulse. The water wasn't still. It was flowing, moving through some hidden artery that breathed below the valley. On one wall, carved into the damp stone, was a rough map. The valley unfolded there in miniature, traced with thin channels that spidered outward from the well. He recognized the curve of the ridge, the placement of the barn, even the faint suggestion of where the orchard used to stand. The lines shimmered faintly under the lantern's glow, filled with moisture that had condensed in their grooves. The well, then, was not a single throat. It was the heart of a whole buried system. He imagined his ancestors digging it by hand, carving these passages with primitive tools and more faith than reason. Perhaps they had known the spring's course, or perhaps they had guessed and guessed right. Beside the map, wedged into the wall's crevice, lay a wooden box swollen by years of damp. Samuel pried it open. Inside were folded pages, their ink faded to brown ghosts. He lifted one carefully. The script was neat, but urgent. August 9th, 1881. The water grows stronger beneath. We channel her through the stone to the fields, but some have seen and grown envious. I have sealed the lower gate. Should harm come to this place, the source will rest until a martin calls her again. The page tore at the edges as he read. Beneath it lay another, barely legible. Fire in the east field tonight. I fear they will come for the well. He read the words twice, feeling the chill of them settle deep in his chest. Fire. The first fire. Not the one he'd known 20 years ago, but another. The original sin of the valley. The handwriting trailed off mid-sentence, the ink blurred by water. Samuel closed the box, his hands shaking. The air around him seemed to hum faintly now, a vibration that moved through the stone into his bones. He lifted the lantern higher, studying the carved channels that ran along the floor. The water in them glimmered, sliding away toward some unseen outlet. He crouched, touched it again. It was cold, colder than it should have been, and deep beneath that chill was something alive. Not alive like a creature, but alive like memory, aware, patient, waiting. When he climbed back to the surface, the rain had stopped. The sky was the color of slate, and mist coiled along the ground like breath. He pulled the stone plate roughly back into place, covering the entrance, then sat beside the well and lit a cigarette he hadn't planned to smoke. The first drag burned dry and harsh. He stared at the horizon where the sun was trying and failing to break through the gray. The thought came, unbidden. The water remembers. That night he dreamt of his great-grandfather, a tall man with a face carved by wind and work. The old man stood by the same well, only it was whole again, surrounded by green fields and the scent of clover. He looked up and said, "The fire comes for what it cannot own." Then he turned, and the world behind him went white with flame. Samuel woke gasping, sweat cold on his back. The wind outside had risen, scraping the tarp and whistling through the cracks of the ruined barn. He sat up, listening. There it was again, that hollow knock, rhythmic now, echoing faintly beneath the ground. He stepped outside, the night full of thin fog and distant lightning. The sound was stronger here, pulsing underfoot. It moved in slow intervals, like the beat of something vast turning in its sleep. He crouched by the well, laid his hand on the rim. The stone was cool, then warmer, then cool again. The water below shimmered faintly, though no moonlight reached it. He whispered, not knowing why, "I'm listening." The wind stilled for the space of a breath. Then, from deep below, came a single low sound. Not quite a word, not quite a rumble. Something between them. When it faded, Samuel stood very still. The air was heavy with the scent of ozone and wet soil. In the distance, the first real thunder rolled across the ridge. He looked toward the barn, toward the dark fields waiting beyond. The valley was awake now. Whatever had been sleeping beneath the ash had remembered its name. And for the first time in 20 years, Samuel felt the same. Morning came slow and golden, the kind that tricked you into thinking the world had forgiven itself. Samuel Martin woke to the smell of wet soil and wood smoke. The storm had passed in the night, leaving everything rinsed and humming. Water dripped from the edges of the tarp in some slow, rhythmic notes, and beyond the well, the ground shimmered like a mirror where puddles caught the sun. He rose stiffly, stretching until his shoulders cracked, and listened. The valley had a voice now. Birds, cautious at first, threaded the air with song. Insects pulsed from the grass, and somewhere far off, a creek, one that had been dry for decades, murmured again. The sound was low but steady, like breath filling long empty lungs. He poured water from the bucket into his tin pot and set it over the coals. The fire hissed to life, and steam coiled upward like smoke from an offering. The warmth reached into his bones. He sipped the coffee slowly, eyes on the well. The circle of damp soil around it had expanded overnight, an irregular bloom now reaching the first row of half-buried stones. The earth there looked darker, alive. He wasn't imagining it anymore. Something beneath was moving. By mid-morning, he was at work again. The trench he'd dug days earlier carried a small but constant flow now, its shallow channel threading through the ruins toward the north field. Samuel followed it, clearing ash and stones from its path. Each shovelful of earth released a smell both sharp and clean, the scent of something waking. At the far edge of the field, where the grass had once grown thick and high, he discovered the outline of another channel, wider, straighter, and clearly man-made. It curved westward, matching the direction he'd seen on the carved map beneath the well. He crouched, brushing the dirt from its edges until the line became clear. The irrigation network wasn't just real, it was enormous. His great-grandfather hadn't just built a farm, he'd built a circulatory system. Samuel spent the rest of the day tracing its reach. Every 100 yards, another junction revealed itself, some clogged with decades of soil, others miraculously intact. By sunset, he'd uncovered enough to see the pattern. All the channels flowed back toward the center, the well, and outward again toward the farthest fields. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, almost sacred in its geometry. He stood in the gathering dusk, hands black with soil, watching the faint glint of water move through the lines he'd cleared. The flow was slow but constant, a pulse finding its rhythm again. It filled him with an emotion he couldn't quite name, something between pride and dread. That night, the wind shifted. It came from the east, warm and restless, carrying a faint smell of oil and dust. He recognized it instantly. Meridian's trucks. The corporation had been buying up land for years. quietly, efficiently, the way drought eats at a riverbank. They'd already taken half the valley, promising irrigation projects, solar farms, sustainable development. Lies dressed in progress. Samuel had ignored them once, content to live in the shrinking shadow of memory. Now, with the water flowing again, he understood what they'd been after all along. He went to the truck and fetched the envelope he'd left unopened on the passenger seat since the day he returned. Inside was a letter on heavy paper, the Meridian logo embossed in gold at the top. Mr. Martin, we are prepared to make you an offer that honors both your family's legacy and the region's future. The land you own sits atop a significant aquifer. With your cooperation, we can ensure this resource is used responsibly to benefit the entire county. He read it again, slower this time. Every line dripped with politeness, every word a blade hidden in velvet. Used responsibly. He could hear the translation in his father's voice, drained dry and sold. He folded the letter neatly, slid it back into the envelope, and tossed it into the fire. The paper curled, blackened, and vanished with a sigh. As he turned to the well, a faint tremor shivered through the ground beneath his feet. The water below rippled, a perfect circle widening outward. He crouched, frowning. "It's all right," he murmured, as if the earth could hear him. "You're safe now." The tremor subsided, leaving only the steady sound of water moving through stone. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone had listened. He slept lightly that night, the wind restless outside. When he finally drifted into dreams, they came sharp and bright. A boy running through golden fields, a woman laughing by a well, smoke on the horizon, then fire. Fire everywhere, the sky red with it. Through the flames, figures moved, carrying torches, shouting names. One word rose above the rest: Martin. He woke before dawn, heart pounding, the echo of the name still ringing in his ears. Outside, the air was cool and damp, the world caught between night and day. He walked to the well, his breath visible in the faint light. The water below glowed faintly, as though reflecting a sun not yet risen. He drew a bucketful and poured it into the trench. The water flowed swiftly, faster than it should have, splitting along the carved channels until it vanished into the field. The earth drank it up eagerly. Samuel crouched and pressed his palm into the soil. It was warm. Something beneath was feeding back. By midday, a new green had appeared at the base of the nearest hill, a thin film of shoots, impossibly bright against the gray. Life was returning faster than sense allowed. He should have been elated, but the air felt heavy, charged. In the distance, a truck engine broke the quiet, then another. He climbed the ridge and saw them. 3 white pickups crawling along the old road like beetles, their sides painted with the Meridian logo. Samuel watched them stop at the old fence line, dust swirling around their wheels. Men got out, suits and boots, clipboard confidence. One pointed toward the well, another raised binoculars. He stayed low, unseen among the rocks. Their voices carried faintly on the wind. Words like survey, claim, rights. He caught one phrase that froze his blood. The water table's moving again. They knew. He waited until they left, the trucks trailing a line of dust back toward the highway. Only then did he descend the ridge. The valley was quiet again, but it was a different quiet, one that knew it had been seen. That evening, as the sun bled out behind the hills, Samuel built a new cover for the well, heavier this time, reinforced with steel brackets scavenged from the barn. He worked until his hands blistered and his back screamed, but he didn't stop. When it was done, the well looked older again, disguised, forgotten. He sat beside it as the stars came out, listening to the faint gurgle of water below. The air was colder now, edged with the scent of coming frost. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote cried, a thin, mournful sound that seemed to echo off the stones. He whispered into the night, half to himself, half to the valley, "They won't take it." Not this time. The wind stirred the grass in answer, a low sigh moving across the fields like breath through lungs. Beneath him, deep within the earth, the water moved faster, rising, pushing outward, as if the land itself had heard and believed him. The valley wasn't done fighting, and neither was he. The next morning arrived jagged and strange. The air was too still, the sky too sharp, a brittle blue that felt ready to shatter. Samuel woke with a start, his ears still ringing from a dream he couldn't quite remember. Only the feeling lingered, heat, roaring, the sound of metal twisting. He sat up, heart pounding, and scanned the valley. Nothing moved. Then he noticed it, a smell in the wind. Not the sweet, clean scent of wet soil he'd grown used to. This was acrid, chemical, faint, but unmistakable. Diesel. He climbed the ridge, the old rifle slung over his shoulder more from habit than intent. From the top, he saw them again. Meridian's trucks, 3 this time, maybe 4, parked near the edge of his boundary. Men in reflective vests moved around a piece of heavy equipment, some kind of drilling rig. Its metal skeleton caught the sunlight like a signal flare. Samuel stood still, his hands tightening on the strap. He'd expected this, but not so soon. The water's movement must have reached their sensors, their monitors, their endless satellites that watched what used to belong to men and memory. He stayed on the ridge until one of the men pointed toward him, a gesture, a shout, then another. They had seen him. He turned and walked back down to the well, not running, not hiding, just walking, deliberate, as though the ground itself needed to see that he would not yield. When he reached the yard, a white pickup was already coming up the old lane. The tires crunched on gravel. The door opened and a man stepped out, mid-40s, pressed jeans, smile polished like glass. "Mr. Martin," he called. "Tom Leland, Meridian Resource Group." "I think we spoke last spring." Samuel said nothing. He remembered the name from the letterhead. The man's smile didn't falter. "I'll get right to it," Leland continued. "We're running new surveys. Hydrological. There's been movement underground, pressure changes. We just want to make sure everything's stable, that no one's at risk." Samuel's gaze didn't waver. "Stable enough?" "Good," Leland said, nodding as though they were partners in something reasonable. "See, the aquifer under this valley feeds half the county. If it shifts, it could cause issues, subsidence, contamination, overflows. We'd like to install a few monitors, maybe take some samples." "No." The man blinked. "I'm sorry?" "You heard me." "Mr. Martin, I don't think you understand. This isn't about property lines, it's about safety. If there's an unregulated spring here, it could—" Samuel stepped closer. "You don't care about safety." His voice was quiet, even. "You care about control. You want to put a meter on what you can't own." Leland's smile cracked slightly, then reformed. "You're emotional. I get that. But the truth is that water belongs to everyone. The sooner we work together, the better." Samuel didn't answer. He turned and walked back toward the well. Leland called something after him, but the words were lost to the wind. The truck idled for a while, then reversed down the lane. Dust hung in its wake like smoke. By afternoon, the valley grew restless. The air thickened, heavy with tension and heat. Clouds stacked along the ridge, gray and bruised, but they didn't break. Samuel worked on reinforcing the barn wall, trying to stay busy, trying not to imagine what Meridian's surveys meant. Every few minutes he caught a flicker of movement on the horizon, metal glinting where it shouldn't. Near dusk, the first real tremor came. It rolled beneath his feet like distant thunder, shaking dust from the beams above. The well water rippled violently, slapping against the stones. He steadied the crank with both hands, heart hammering. "Easy," he murmured. "Hold on." Then silence, the kind that hums in the bones. He lit a lantern and peered down. The water had settled, but deeper below, faint vibrations continued. A steady thrum, rhythmic, unnatural. Machines. Meridian was drilling into the valley's veins.